I was born in a peat land that is actually 7 meters under sea level in the Netherlands. So it was one of the peatlands that was kind of an example project for Europe, like for peatland transitions, because peat is a kind of it's a carbon sink. It holds a lot of CO2. It has a very interesting biodiversity, and but because of the current use of peat for instance, dairy farming or for other agricultural practices, it evaporates in the air because it's like kept too dry in a way, and it sinks and sinks. So yeah, I'm without myself knowing, I grew up in this kind of landscape, and then from 2009 to 2013, I worked on a project, on a first project on peatlands, and then after that, I moved to Arles, which is not a peatland but a wetland, so in the south of France, but has still kind of similar challenges, such as working with wet crops like reeds and other kind of rushes that grow well in these kind of environments. And then after like working in the south of France for 10 years, I was asked back by Arcadia, a cultural foundation in the Netherlands, if I could start a kind of bio design lab like I did in Arles in south of France in the Frisian peatlands. And the Frisian peat meadow region is like all peatland regions facing these challenges like the emissions, loss of biodiversity, land subsidence. Um, and I thought could be an interesting next step after having worked on bioregional practices in the south of France to work on peatlands, because first I know a lot of it, and it's kind of it's an important testing ground for the world, like worldwide. Um, it's a landscaping crisis. So yeah, that's in short how I came to work on peatlands. Everything is very micro in peatland, and it's under your feet. So it's much easier to like get feelings or engage with the Amazon forest than with the peatland. It's like muddy, it's wet, it's a, but it stores like about 50 times more CO2 than a forest. So it's really a very important landscape in the world. Um, and also it's because peat is basically like plants that like how do you say like yeah, it's made out of plant material, but plants are all different plants. So in a way, all peat is different, and sometimes there's a bit of clay on top, and so it's also very difficult to give a kind of mono solution for peat. So it really needs a kind of a very diverse approach, and it's very complex as a as a landscape type. Um, and then, yeah, for instance, in Friesland, the current economy is like very industrial dairy farming. And this dairy farming, it results in like powder milk that mainly goes to the Asian market. So it's in a way very absurd thing that we still think about this as a kind of profitable model. Yeah, where all these like emissions come free in the air by these dairy practices. So it's very evident also for people living and working, having their economy in the peat, that something needs to change, but there's no new perspective. So one of the points that I'm trying to make with the Peat Meadow Atelier is that we should not look for like the conventional a business case, like, or a profit model, but it's more like a model of existence. You know, how life is possible also in a broader sense, not only human life, but the life of the, like, let's say the peat ecology. And in that sense, I think that's of course something that we actually should do everywhere in the world, but it's so urgent to do it in these peat landscapes. So it's each project is a collaboration with people from the area, like farmers or scientists or companies, like for instance in the construction sector or something like that, and designers with who all agreed on a collaborative approach. So it's not a classical model where like a designer more let's say steers the project, but also like projects go, it's a kind of group we created, a group of people who reflect on each other's work in a way. And so there are, in the exhibition, we feature three main projects. One is on wet crop furniture, like it's scalable furniture. So it's really like combining industrial design knowledge with the knowledge that is now built on growing these wet crops on peat. And one project is about working with microorganisms from the peatlands as an alternative for color. So it's with London-based design studio Faber Futures, which of course that for them is the core of their work. But what is new for them in this project is they actually implement their technology in a real situation with a farmer. So it's also a lot about who has access to biotech, for instance. So that project is, yeah, so it's on soil health, like producing color with bacteria from the soil, but also about a decentralized idea of how we deal with clothing and coloring clothing. So it's very, for the people in the area, this is like super wow. This project is, it was amazing to see, like we made a beautiful, like, a videography with all the different stakeholders that were involved in the project, and the scientists, the local scientists that worked with actually local strains, like that we really sampled on the on the peatland. He trained them basically to produce color, and he was just so proud because it design also brings out their scientific work in a totally different way, and it makes it like more like it's much more generous towards the community. So that was I think very nice to see how that worked, and also yeah, it brought farmers more into a conversation with their soil, because all those farmers, they learned basically how to fertilize on peat with chemical fertilizers, but they're not, so they're, through these projects of the Veenweide Atelier, their relationship with the land gets yeah, it's growing deeper connections in a way. And then there was another project on repurposing heritage. So you have all these monumental farms that were once for, like, yeah, for the cows and for hay storage, etc. And so it's it was very much about what to yeah, how do we think about renovation of heritage today, and how can we also include these new locally grown materials, but also how can we think with the community? So how can we really do this renovation in a very open process? And there's also the particular farm we repurposing, it's owned by a nature conservation organization. And I think it's also very interesting that they start to see built environment also as nature. So they yeah, they want to make like a bold statement about what um, yeah, how from their point of view, wanting to preserve these peatlands, how a building should be done. These were the main projects. We also did a project with Church Veenhoven, who oh, by the way, the project on the heritage farm, it's with Oos Architects, and they work a lot in India as well. So yeah, it was also very nice to bring all these international people to this place in Friesland. But then there's one more project which was more focusing on material development, for instance, with mycelium and wet crops, growing kind of new materials for like insulation or floaters or foundations. We didn't even know what it would become, but it was really also done in conversation with the farmers, because the farmers in this area, they have certain machines and they have certain techniques with which they ferment already grass. So it's very close to them to start fermenting and working with, for instance, mushrooms. So it was very yeah, a lot of experiments introduced also in the area, which I believe is necessary to tackle complex challenges, because when a crisis like in the peatlands becomes so like a polycrisis, we call it the polycrisis pancake, because it's like I don't know, energy problems, housing problems, biodiversity problems, water problems, like all this. So it's you should like very holistically kind of approach it, but that's difficult if you don't act. So I always say like doing is maybe a better form of thinking in you know, when the complexity is this high. The past 10 years, with when I initiated and worked on the Atelier LUMA project, where it was for me the first time that I had the chance given by the LUMA Foundation to work on the scale of a bioregion. And then yeah, it's in a way it starts with mappings, of course, like mappings, like more from desk research, but also very embodied mappings and meeting people on site, to kind of find places that can work as a kind of yeah, for pilot projects, or I also call it a kind of acupuncture method, so that you find yeah, different it could be sites to work on, but it could also be topics to work on that you feel can yeah, are very particular for the place, or like for instance here in the wetlands in Camargue, you have a lot of algae because you have a lot of water, and also you have salt, so you know, and there's salt industry, so you know that when you work, how you work on algae, you don't know yet, but you know that this is kind of a unique feature for this landscape, and there's communities kind of connected to it. So you're kind of looking for threads. I always call it threads, existing threads in a landscape that you could like weave with. Um, and then yeah, of course, in the peatlands, I've talked to many farmers, because not all farmers are the same. Also to understand, like, because you have old farmers and young farmers, of course, have the future. But then it need to be young farmers that are curious, you know, that can handle like maybe uncertainty, or that are eager to experiment. So it's a kind of um, Yeah, a lot of intuition also needed, I think, in structuring these collaborations, and sometimes, of course, it also fails. Um, but yeah, at the same time, also always asking yourself, also throughout the process, like, okay, who is not on the table? You know, who are we missing out in this project? And like keeping never, yeah, keeping always your process relatively open. Um, and yeah, it's a search because I really think that innovation often comes from these yeah, who actually work together and what like expertises are brought together. But they really like, for instance, between the local scientists and Faber Futures, it was like a quite a big gap to bridge of how they worked, also in language. And so sometimes it's difficult also how you build trust, because on one hand you need this like um, interspecies like connection, or like multiple voices, multiple expertise, but then you get a very like unstable like situation. So then I think it's good to give enough time for things to yeah, to work together. So it's like cooking a bit. Scale is, of course, always a question, because for things to work for the world, let's say, and not just as a prototype, it also need to make sense in terms of quantities. So, for instance, with Atelier LUMA, we did a lot of work also on colors, like for instance, colors derived from we call it the uprooted or newly arrived species, such as here you have this Arundodonax, a giant reed. In Camargue, we call that Can de Provence. And it grows so fast that it need to be taken away all the time, and it has no other purpose than being burned like as a biomass. But you can make, for instance, also color or paper or other things with it. But then there's always this question of like, when is the season? What is the growth time? How to distribute? How to harvest? How to access the location where it grows? Like these kind of things. Now with the Doerenbout project in Friesland, I've worked with a designer from IKEA, who's also he was born in Friesland in the peatlands. So this is great because that means that you don't have the problem that he doesn't understand the regional reality, because that is often that you get if you work with designers that work with a certain new technology from the lab, or that is not, it's not like it doesn't, it's not situated. So then to situate this technology in a region, that's then a lot of work. But so we didn't have that problem. So in a way, he beautifully like kind of could grasp kind of local identity and like desires, but also yeah, history of design there, with like where the industry or of a global furniture concern, where that is going, and how like what we work on now can be even a kind of prototype for them, so that you know that they will not do it because the plants don't have scale yet. But you can, by doing such a project on a smaller scale, get in conversation with such a bigger company. Um, but then, of course, we right now there's not yet enough of this cattail and reed growing. What I'm doing now, and I'm also using the exhibition for that, to have conversations with different people, with bankers, with farmers, to show and to let them love this furniture series, because I think it's very beautiful, and it really brings you already in in that future where this is possible. And I hope that the exhibition really functions as such to reach this scale and to convince more people to dare to grow these new crops, of which they have no idea how that works, but also for the banks to like provide more support and think a bit less conventional. I think it's often a lot about policies, regulations, and financial support when you talk about scale, of course. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done. But also, like, governments can be very not helping when you want to realize new ideas. So they also need to allow buildings to be repurposed in a different way, things like that. Um, or like, of course, with the nature organizations that I worked with, there's always like a big group in these conservation organizations that think that nature is just about I don't know, animals and plants, but they forget that that model of um, nature conservation is very old, and there's like also only old people working there, so they also need to kind of think of new ideas. I'm not actively working with the atelier, also because I think after 8 years, it's good to take a sabbatical to kind of like refresh. Um, but of course, like, we took those beginning years to really develop from scratch biomaterials, to look at, like, for instance, the wool cycle also here, where it is like not functioning because wool is still seen as a waste, and like whereas it is a wonderful fiber that can have a lot of applications. But so now I think at this moment the focus is more on collaborations with partners outside, and I think there's a lot to learn also. Like, we of course worked the first years on connecting the LUMA campus with the region, and also working on some like cafes, restaurants, our own workshop building, and making a very bold statement of what bioregional design could be and how it could look like. And I think it's very important to really see more with different brands and companies. Like, for instance, there's a project in Champagne region that is done, and to see like how the because it's not only about recipes, of course, because the materials will be different in every place. So it's really more about the methodology of how to how to study ecology and social relations in a place, and then how to react with design on it. And so I think it's a bit more, on one hand, a bit more reflective year for the atelier, and so testing more with all the challenges, of course, that brands also have now with all the new environmental regulations, and there's lots of work to do. And I think there's a lot of talking, about it, and there's little, like really very few, let's say, teams or bodies that actually can um, actively find ways of manifesting in the real world. And I think this is very special about what Atelier LUMA does and what I'm also trying to do with the. I think it's happening. It's it's really on its way, and it's yeah, beautiful to see kind of different approaches. And I think it's very important to keep the conversation like open and like trans-regional also, so that there's learning from what happens in different places, because otherwise things can also get stuck in kind of regional politics, etc. And it's really important that that doesn't happen. So I really believe in a kind of distributed, centralized approaches, and also all kinds of people trying different ways. But what you don't want is everyone like inventing the wheel at the same time by themselves. So yeah, I hope that kind of new platforms will come up that facilitate this kind of, and maybe new schools to facilitate a kind of knowledge exchange. Um, but I also really believe in design science collaborations, because of course a lot of like new ideas also come from science, but it's much faster if collaborations with architects and designers happen. So it things are like, as they're, let's say, thought of in the lab in parallel, already kind of tested out on, like, for instance, testing grounds like the peat meadow.